You walk into a room full of strangers and you already know what to do, how to read the energy, how to adjust your tone without thinking about it, how to make people comfortable before they even realize they weren't. You've been doing it your whole life. And if somebody asked you where you learned that, you probably wouldn't say school. But that's exactly where it started. I'm Frank, and today we're talking about something a lot of you lived but never really sat down and examined. What it was like growing up black and going to an all-white school. Not the history lesson version, the real one. The version where your mama dropped you off and you had to figure the rest out on your own. A lot of you born between 1965 and 1980 ended up in predominantly white schools, not because of some grand social experiment you signed up for, but because your parents made a choice. They looked at the schools in their district, they looked at the schools across town, and they picked the one with the better resources, the better teachers, the better shot. By 1988, roughly 43% of black students in the South were attending predominantly white schools. That was the peak, the highest that number ever got. Your parents were part of that wave, and whether they told you or not, a lot of them were terrified because they knew what they were sending you into. They just believed what you'd get out of it was worth the cost. So let's start with the part you remember most. The first day. You walk in, you look around, and it hits you. You're the only one, or one or two, maybe three if you were lucky. And nobody hands you a manual for that. Nobody sits you down and says, here's how you handle being the only black face in a room full of people who've never been around somebody like you. You just figure it out. You learn to scan. You learn to listen before you talk. You learn to pick up on things that other kids your age never even thought about, like who's safe, who's curious, and who's already made up their mind about you before you opened your mouth. And the friendships, that's where it gets complicated. Because you did make friends, real ones. The kid who sat next to you in third grade, the one who invited you to their birthday party and didn't make it weird. You bonded over cartoons and kickball and who had the better lunch. And up until about 4th or 5th grade, it worked. It was easy. Because kids at that age don't carry the weight of what their parents think. Not yet. But something shifts around 10 or 11. Research on cross-racial friendship shows that kids in diverse settings form those bonds easily in the early years, but a lot of them start pulling apart by the time they hit middle school. And it wasn't always about somebody being mean. Sometimes it was just a slow realization that your lives were starting to look different. They were going to summer camp. You were going to your cousin's house. They were talking about their lake house. You were figuring out how to stretch what was in the fridge. The gap wasn't personal, but it was real, and you felt it. Then there were the ones who stayed. The white friend who genuinely didn't care, who came to your house and ate your mama's food and didn't act like they were visiting another country. You held on to that friend because they felt honest. But even that friendship had limits, because there were conversations you couldn't have with them. Things about your family, your neighborhood, the way your parents talked about the world at home that just wouldn't translate. You learned early that friendship in a white school meant a certain kind of closeness with a ceiling on it. Now, let's talk about the thing that lived in your head every single day, the performance, because that's what it was. You were performing, not because you were fake, because the rules were different for you, and you knew it before anybody explained it. If you were too loud, you were a problem. If you were too quiet, you were suspicious. If you were too smart, you were showing off. If you struggled, you confirmed something they already believed. You were walking a line that didn't exist for anybody else in that building, and you walked it every day from the time the bell rang until your mama picked you up. A study out of Duke University found that black students who attended predominantly white high schools actually had higher graduation rates than their black peers at mixed race or predominantly black schools. But here's what that stat doesn't tell you. The social experience in those schools was harder. The pressure was different. You might have gotten a better education on paper, but you paid for it in ways that don't show up in a report. Like the hair thing. Somebody always wanted to touch your hair. Always. And you were a kid, so you didn't know how to say stop without making it a thing, so you let them. and then you felt strange about it for the rest of the day. Or the questions, why is your skin that color? Does it wash off? Why does your hair do that? And these weren't mean kids. These were kids who had never been around a black person in their life. You were there first, and you became the unofficial ambassador for an entire race before you even knew what that meant. Then there was the classroom. The moment the teacher brought up slavery or the civil rights movement or anything involving black people, and every head in the room turned to look at you like you were about to give a speech, like you had the answers because you happened to be black. You were 11. You didn't have answers. You had a knot in your stomach and a wish that the floor would swallow you whole. And you sat there and smiled or shrugged or said something short so they'd all turn back around. That was your education inside the education, learning how to shrink without disappearing. Now, here's where the other side comes in, the part your own people gave you trouble for. Because when you went home or when you saw black kids from other schools, you got hit with something just as heavy. You talked too proper. You acted different. You were trying to be white. Research has been tracking that phrase since the mid-1980s. Scholars Fordham and Ogbu published their landmark study in 1986, showing that in some environments, black students who did well academically got accused of acting white by their peers. And a later study found that roughly 41% of high-achieving black adolescents in integrated schools had been accused of exactly that. So you were too black for the white kids and too white for the black kids. And there you were, standing in the middle, belonging to both and neither at the same time. And you couldn't talk about it, not really. Your parents told you to keep your head down and do well. Your teachers didn't see it. Your white friends didn't get it. And the black kids who accused you didn't care what it felt like on your end. So you just carried it like a backpack full of rocks that nobody could see. And you got so used to the weight you forgot it was there. Let's talk about activities, because a lot of you found your lifeline there. Sports, dance, drama, debate, something where the rules were clear and the playing field was closer to level. A personal account from a black student who grew up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and attended white schools from 5th grade through 12th grade, said that athletics were the only time he felt seen, the only time the rest of it faded. Because on the field or on the court, your body was doing something everybody understood. You were fast, or you were strong, or you had good hands. And for those hours, the other stuff didn't matter as much. A lot of you chased that feeling for years. Some of you are still chasing it. But here's something you might not have thought about. That experience taught you something nobody else in your age group had to learn that early. You learned how to read a room. You learned how to adjust. You learned how to build trust with people who didn't start out trusting you. You learned how to hold your identity tight while moving through a space that wasn't designed for you. And when you hit the workforce, that became a superpower. A survey of Fortune 100 companies found that 96% of major employers say it's important for employees to be comfortable working with colleagues and clients from diverse cultural backgrounds. You were trained for that before you had a resume. You learned things in those schools that your parents couldn't teach you and that your own community didn't always understand. You learned that the world is wider than one neighborhood, that people can surprise you in both directions, that someone can be your friend and still not fully understand your life, and that you can hold space for all of that without losing yourself. It didn't always feel like a gift. Some days it felt like a punishment, but you kept showing up. You kept adjusting. You kept doing the math on who you were versus who they needed you to be. And somewhere along the way, you stopped needing anybody's permission to be both. There's a personal essay that sticks with me. A woman who grew up as one of the few black kids in a predominantly white school wrote about her friendship with a white girl named Amanda. They were inseparable. Their teacher called them Ebony and Ivory. Amanda directed their class play about Rosa Parks. They had deep conversations about things most kids their age never thought about. But by the time junior high ended, they had drifted, not because of a fight, because their worlds started splitting along racial lines. They couldn't share the same makeup, couldn't talk about the same boys, couldn't move through each other's circles the way they used to. And the woman wrote that eventually she decided she needed black friends, girls who liked the same boys, went to churches like hers, understood her world without her having to translate it. That drift wasn't a failure, it was a reckoning, and a lot of you went through the exact same thing. Here's what I want to leave you with. That school didn't define you, but it did shape you. It gave you a skill set that most people don't develop until their 30s, if they develop it at all. You learn how to be the only one in the room and still belong there. You learn how to listen for what people mean instead of just what they say. You learn how to hold your tongue when it mattered and how to speak up when it counted. And you learn that your identity isn't something that gets weaker when it's tested. It gets sharper. Your parents made a bet. They bet that the education would outweigh the isolation, that the access would outweigh the awkwardness, that you'd come out the other side with something they couldn't give you from inside their own four walls. And most of you did. You came out knowing how to survive anywhere. You came out knowing that comfort isn't the same thing as safety, and that belonging isn't the same thing as fitting in. You learned the difference between the two before you were old enough to drive. And now you're in your 40s and 50s. You've built careers and families and lives that pull from everything those years taught you. And sometimes, when you're the only black person in a conference room or at a dinner party or in a neighborhood, you feel that old muscle kick in, the scanning, the adjusting, the reading, and you realize you've been doing it so long, it's second nature. It doesn't scare you anymore. It might annoy you. It might tire you out, but it doesn't scare you because you already survived the hardest version of it. You survived it when you were 8 years old, walking into a classroom where nobody looked like you, carrying nothing but your mama's voice in your head, telling you to be twice as good. And you were. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.